It was a bright and sunny afternoon in the heart of the city. The famous royal palace stood proudly, a place of tradition and history, where tourists from all over the world gathered every day. Among the crowd, a young tourist named Jake, in his early 20s, was visiting the city for the first time. He had been dreaming of this trip for years, eager to see the grand buildings and experience the culture. With his backpack slung over his shoulder, Jake felt excited as he walked along the cobbled streets. He had spent the morning exploring the beautiful sights of the city, taking photos and admiring the architecture. Everything seemed perfect, and the energy around him was contagious. As he approached the palace, he couldn't help but notice the royal guards standing still and tall at their posts, their red uniforms contrasting with the blue sky. People paused to take pictures with the guards, who remained perfectly still, their eyes forward, as if they were statues. Jake had always been fascinated by the royal guards, their serious expressions, and the way they stood without moving. He had seen videos online, laughing at the funny ways tourists would try to make the guards react. It was a game to some, but to Jake it was all just part of the fun. What he didn't realize was that the guards were there for a reason: to protect, not entertain. Feeling a bit tipsy from the beers he had been enjoying with some friends earlier, Jake thought it would be funny to join in on the playful spirit. With a mischievous grin on his face, he reached for his beer can and raised it high. He had seen others do silly things in front of the guards before, so he figured it would be a harmless joke. With a loud laugh, he tossed the beer right toward the royal guard standing at attention. The can of beer hit the guard squarely on the shoulder, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The crowd gasped. Some onlookers chuckled nervously, unsure of what would happen next. Jake stood there for a moment, his laughter dying in his throat as he watched the guard remain perfectly still. It was clear that the guard hadn't reacted, but the tension in the air was palpable. For Jake, it was just a silly joke, a moment of boldness fueled by a few drinks. But to everyone else, it was far from funny. The royal guard did not flinch, but his face hardened. His silence sent a message that was far more serious than Jake had imagined. Slowly, security guards approached, their eyes fixed on Jake. The mood shifted immediately from lightheartedness to something much more serious. As the security guards moved in, Jake felt a cold rush of panic. This wasn't a joke anymore. The crowd around him began to murmur, and Jake's friends quickly backed away, unsure of what to do. The reality of the situation began to sink in. He had done something he thought was harmless, but it had quickly turned into a serious problem. The moment the beer can hit the royal guard, the crowd seemed to freeze in place. Jake stood there, unsure of what to do next. His heart was racing, and for a brief moment, everything felt like a bad dream. He had never expected his little joke to cause such a scene. The air was thick with tension as the silence stretched on. The royal guard remained still, his expression unreadable. He didn't move a muscle, not even to brush the beer off his uniform. Jake could see the faintest hint of a frown on the guard's face, but otherwise, he didn't show any emotion. It was as if the man was waiting for something. Then, without warning, the first security guard arrived. He was tall and built like someone who took his job very seriously. His eyes locked onto Jake with a look that made the young tourist's stomach twist. Behind him, other security guards began to gather, surrounding Jake in a way that made him feel trapped. "Sir, come with us," one of the security guards said, his voice calm but firm. It was clear that this was no longer a harmless prank. Jake's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to say. His friends had already taken a few steps back, their faces a mix of concern and confusion. None of them knew how to handle the situation. As the guards led Jake away from the crowd, whispers filled the air. People were talking about what had just happened. Some were shocked, others seemed to find it amusing. But Jake could feel the eyes of everyone on him. He had become the center of attention, but not in the way he had ever imagined. "Why are you doing this?" Jake asked, his voice shaky as he was escorted to a nearby building. It was just a joke. His words were rushed, trying to explain away what he had done. But deep down, he knew it wasn't going to work. The security guards didn't respond. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than any words could have been. They had seen things like this before, and they knew how seriously it was taken when someone disrespects the royal guard, no matter how minor the action seemed. The feeling of dread in Jake's chest only grew stronger as they reached a small room where he was asked to sit. The whole situation was so overwhelming. His mind was spinning, and for the first time, he realized that he had gone too far. What had seemed like a harmless prank was now spiraling into something much bigger. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Jake was informed that he would be facing charges for his actions. The reality of the situation hit him hard. His heart sank as the officers began to speak in serious tones, explaining how disrespecting the royal guard was a criminal offense. He had no idea that throwing a beer could lead to something this serious. In his mind, it was just a harmless act of rebellion, something that was supposed to get a laugh. But as the situation unfolded, Jake realized the consequences were not at all what he had expected. The officers took his details, and Jake's thoughts were filled with regret. He couldn't believe what he had just done. He had come to the city to enjoy himself, but now he was in deep trouble. Jake sat quietly in the small room, his mind racing. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed in his ears. He couldn't believe what was happening. Only a few minutes ago, he had been excited to explore the city. And now, here he was, facing something far more serious than he ever imagined. The thought of spending time in prison was the last thing he had expected when he woke up that morning. The officers continued to talk to him, their voices steady and serious. Jake tried to explain that he hadn't meant any harm, that it was just a joke, but the words didn't seem to matter. Every time he spoke, they just nodded and continued with their questions, as if they had already heard it all before. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was no longer about a harmless prank. It was about something much bigger. One of the officers, a woman with short brown hair, asked Jake to step outside the room. He followed her down a narrow hallway, the walls lined with faded pictures of the royal palace and its guards. Everything felt surreal. He couldn't help but feel like he was caught in a whirlwind that he couldn't escape from. The whole scene seemed like something out of a movie, not real life. Outside, the royal guard still stood in place, their eyes watching everything with a quiet intensity. They had not moved an inch since Jake threw the beer at one of them. The calmness of their demeanor only made Jake feel worse. He had always seen videos online of tourists trying to make the guards react, but he never realized the seriousness of their role. They weren't there for entertainment. They were part of something far more important, and now Jake had disrespected that. The officer led Jake to a small waiting area, where a group of other tourists sat, looking just as confused as he felt. Some were chatting quietly, while others stared ahead, lost in thought. Jake took a seat, his hand shaking slightly as he stared at the floor. The thought of what could come next was almost too much to bear. A few minutes later, a new officer arrived. He was older, with a stern face and a deep voice. He immediately addressed Jake, his tone serious. "You've caused a disturbance, and now you will have to face the consequences," the officer said. "This isn't something we take lightly. The royal guard is respected by everyone, and when you threw that beer, you disrespected not only the guard, but the entire tradition they represent." Jake's stomach twisted. The gravity of the situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. The authorities took this seriously, and he would have to answer for his actions. The officer continued, explaining how disrespecting the royal guard was considered a crime in this city. Jake felt the weight of the words. What had seemed like a harmless prank to him now appeared to be a serious offense. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had escalated. He never imagined that a simple moment of poor judgment would lead him to this point. As the minutes ticked by, Jake's mind kept replaying the moment when he threw the beer. He wished he could go back and stop himself, but there was no way to undo it now. He would have to face whatever consequences came next. As Jake sat in the small room, anxiously waiting for the next step, he began to think more about the royal guard he had thrown the beer at. The moment played over and over in his mind, and for the first time, he wondered what the guard had been thinking when it happened. He had been so caught up in his own idea of a joke that he had never considered what the guard's job really meant. The royal guards were more than just statues in uniforms. They were symbols of respect and tradition. They had been trained to remain calm and composed, no matter what happened around them. Jake had heard the stories. The guards didn't move, didn't show emotion, and didn't react to anything that might happen around them, no matter how strange or funny it might seem to others. They were there to protect, not to entertain. But what was it like for them? What did they feel when they were standing at attention, knowing that their role carried so much weight? The moment Jake had thrown the beer, he had seen the guard's eyes briefly shift, and then everything had gone silent. In that moment, the guard hadn't flinched. He hadn't yelled at Jake or made any sign that he was bothered. Instead, the guard's reaction had been calm, almost too calm. The more Jake thought about it, the more he realized how much he had misjudged the situation. What had seemed like a harmless joke to him had probably been a serious violation in the eyes of the guard. Jake imagined how frustrating it must have been for someone who worked so hard to maintain their composure, only to be disrespected in front of a crowd of strangers. The guard had not moved, not because he didn't care, but because he had to remain in control. He had a duty, and Jake had completely misunderstood it. The guard's training was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. It was a life of discipline, standing at attention for hours, withstanding all kinds of distractions, and always maintaining a stoic expression. There was no room for mistakes or emotional reactions. The royal guards had to be perfect, no matter the situation, no matter what happened. Jake's mind wandered further, imagining what the guard must have thought when the beer hit his shoulder. Maybe he had been disappointed. Maybe he had felt that the respect for his role was being diminished. Whatever it was, the guard had stayed silent, just like he was trained to do. It was as if he had expected this kind of disrespect, and he knew how to handle it with dignity. But the calmness of the guard only made Jake feel worse. The guard's strength was not in his uniform or his posture. It was in his ability to stay silent, to not let the actions of a careless tourist shake his sense of duty. And now, Jake understood just how serious the situation was. It wasn't just about throwing a beer at someone. It was about disrespecting something that many people valued deeply. As Jake sat in the waiting room, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the guard had shown more strength and control in that moment than Jake ever would have. And that was something he would have to live with. The room felt colder now. Jake had been sitting quietly for what felt like hours, the ticking of a clock the only sound that kept him company. He had tried to calm himself down, but the reality of the situation kept hitting him like a wave. He had no idea what would happen next. What had started as a simple, foolish joke was now something much more serious, and there was no going back. Soon, an officer came into the room, her serious expression telling Jake that the time for explanations was over. "It's time," she said. "You're going to court now." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected things to move so quickly. It felt like everything was happening too fast, and he wasn't ready for what was coming. As Jake was escorted out of the room, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. The officers were silent as they led him down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the quiet building. He passed by several rooms, each one filled with people involved in different cases, but nothing seemed to matter now. Jake was the one who was in trouble. He was the one who had made the mistake. When they finally reached the courtroom, Jake was struck by the seriousness of the place. The large wooden doors, the rows of benches, and the judge's raised platform all made him feel small and out of place. He had never been in a courtroom before, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. The reality of it all was sinking in. He was led to a seat in the front, and the court began to fill with people, lawyers, the prosecutor, and other officials. The judge entered the room, a tall man in a black robe, and everyone stood up. Jake followed suit, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He didn't know what to expect, but he could tell that this was no small matter. The judge's stern look seemed to confirm that. The prosecutor stood up and began to speak. He was a middle-aged man with a serious tone, and his words carried weight. He talked about how throwing beer at a royal guard wasn't just a harmless prank. It was an offense that showed disrespect for the tradition and the duties of the royal guard. Jake's face reddened with embarrassment as the prosecutor laid out the details of the incident. The beer, the guard's professionalism, and the public disturbance. It all sounded much worse than he had imagined. Jake could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. The judge turned to him next. "Do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" the judge asked, his voice calm but firm. Jake nodded, unable to speak at first. He hadn't expected to be asked directly, but he knew this was his moment to show that he understood what he had done. I didn't mean any harm," Jake said quietly. "It was a joke. I never thought it would turn out like this." The judge didn't respond right away, but his eyes never left Jake. The silence in the room was heavy, and Jake could feel the pressure of it. He wished he could take it all back, that he could go back to the moment before he had thrown that beer. But there was no way to change what had happened. All he could do now was face the consequences. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke. "This court does not take lightly the disrespect shown to those who serve our country and uphold tradition. Your actions have consequences." Jake felt a chill run through him. The weight of those words made him realize that he was in deeper trouble than he had ever imagined. The legal proceedings had begun, and Jake had no idea where they would take him. But one thing was clear. His life was about to change forever. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Jake sat in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. The judge's words had already made it clear that this was no minor issue. But now, as the prosecutor began to speak again, Jake's stomach churned with nerves. He couldn't believe he was in this position. He had come to the city to enjoy his vacation, to see the sights, and now he was caught up in a legal battle that could change everything. The prosecutor, a man with dark, serious eyes, stepped forward and continued his speech. His voice was calm but firm, and every word seemed to carry weight. He talked about the seriousness of the offense, how disrespecting a royal guard was not only a crime, but also an attack on the very traditions and values that the country held dear. The prosecutor painted a picture of the royal guard as symbols of honor and duty, and how Jake's actions had undermined that honor. As the prosecutor spoke, Jake felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He hadn't realized how much his actions had impacted the situation. What had seemed like a silly prank in his mind now appeared as a disrespectful and careless act. The prosecutor went on, explaining how the guard had been standing there, doing his job, and how Jake had disrupted it by throwing beer at him. The crowd in the courtroom was still, every person listening carefully to every word. The prosecutor finished his speech and nodded at the judge. Now it was time for Jake's defense. The lawyer who had been assigned to Jake's case stood up and walked to the front. He was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, but Jake could see the seriousness in his eyes. The lawyer began by addressing the court, explaining that Jake had not intended to cause harm. This was not a premeditated act, the lawyer said. Jake was intoxicated and made a poor decision in a moment of foolishness. Jake could feel his heart pounding as the lawyer continued to speak on his behalf. The lawyer was trying to show that Jake's actions were not out of malice, but rather the result of a poor choice in a moment of excitement. Jake wanted to speak up and explain himself, to apologize for what he had done, but he knew it wasn't the right time. His lawyer was doing his best to help, and he had to trust that the judge would listen carefully. The judge listened to the defense with a neutral expression, his eyes never leaving the lawyer or Jake. After a few minutes, The lawyer finished his argument and returned to his seat. There was a brief pause as the judge reviewed everything that had been said. Jake could feel his nerves building again. What would happen next? Would the judge be lenient, or would the consequences be more severe than he imagined? Finally, the judge spoke, his voice steady but firm. The court has heard both sides, and the seriousness of this incident cannot be overlooked, the judge said. Disrespecting the royal guard is not something we can treat lightly, regardless of intention. However, the court will consider your lack of prior offenses and your willingness to take responsibility for your actions. Jake held his breath as the judge continued. He wasn't sure whether the judge was going to be lenient or not, but at least there was a chance that he wouldn't face the harshest consequences. The courtroom remained silent, and Jake's fate was now in the hands of the judge. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for the judge's decision. Jake could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat growing louder in his ears. His palms were sweaty, and his mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. Would the judge be kind and show some mercy, or would he face a harsh punishment for his foolish mistake? The judge sat at his desk, flipping through some papers. The room felt heavier with each passing second. Jake tried to hold on to hope, but the reality of the situation kept creeping in. He had thrown a beer at a royal guard, something that most people would never dare to do. He had been foolish, and now he was about to find out what consequences he would face. Finally, the judge looked up, his gaze steady and calm. "The court has carefully considered everything," the judge said. His voice filled the room, and everyone listened closely to his every word. "You have admitted to your mistake, and you have expressed remorse. However, disrespecting a royal guard is a serious offense. It is not a matter to be taken lightly." Jake's stomach twisted. He had hoped for a more lenient sentence, but it was clear now that the judge was not going to be soft on him. He clenched his fists in his lap, trying to stay calm. The judge continued, "The royal guard represents something much larger than just one individual. They are symbols of tradition, respect, and duty. To disrespect them is to disrespect all those who serve this country." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew the judge was right. He had not just thrown a beer at a guard. He had disrespected everything the guard stood for. He felt the weight of his actions more than ever. The judge paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then he spoke again. "As this is your first offense, and you have shown remorse for your actions, the court has decided on a punishment that reflects the seriousness of the crime, but also takes your circumstances into account." Jake held his breath, waiting for the judge to finish. His thoughts were spinning, but he tried to stay focused. What would the punishment be? The judge finally spoke the words that Jake had been dreading. "You are hereby sentenced to 1 year in prison." The room seemed to go quiet as the judge's words echoed in Jake's ears. 1 year. The punishment was severe, but it wasn't as bad as Jake had feared. He had expected something even worse, but the reality of the sentence still hit him hard. A year in prison would change everything for him. It was a long time to spend away from his life, from the people he cared about, and from the future he had imagined. Jake sat there, numb, as the judge continued speaking about the details of his sentence. He heard the words, but they didn't seem real. A part of him was still back in that moment when he had thrown the beer. He wished he could go back and make a different choice, but there was no turning back now. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. The gavel came down with a sharp sound, marking the end of the trial. Jake felt like he had been in a dream, but the reality of the verdict hit him like a cold wave. The consequences of his actions were real, and he would have to face them head-on. Jake stood up slowly, the weight of the judge's words still hanging in the air. 1 year in prison. It felt unreal. He couldn't quite grasp it. How had his trip to the city turned into this nightmare? He had just thrown a beer in a moment of foolishness, and now his life was about to change in a way he never expected. The courtroom began to empty as the judge's decision was final. Jake was still trying to process everything. His legs felt weak, and his hand shook as the officers led him out of the courtroom. He had hoped for some kind of miracle, but now he understood that there was no escaping the reality of what he had done. A year in prison. It was a long time, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret. Outside, the bright sunlight seemed so far away. The city felt distant, almost unrecognizable. Jake had come here to see the sights, to explore, but now, the streets seemed cold and unfamiliar. The only thing that mattered now was the prison that awaited him. As the officers escorted him to the holding cell, Jake thought about what was to come. He would be locked away for a year away from everything he knew, away from his family and friends, away from the life he had taken for granted. He thought about his parents and how they would react to the news. They had always taught him to be responsible, to think before acting. How would they feel when they heard what he had done? The prison wasn't far, but the short walk felt like a journey of its own. Jake's mind raced with thoughts of what life inside would be like. Would he be treated fairly? Would he make any friends, or would he be alone in his cell, thinking about how he had ruined everything? His thoughts spiraled out of control, and he had trouble keeping them straight. When they finally reached the prison, Jake was led through a series of hallways and doors, each one more daunting than the last. The walls were cold and gray, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. This was not the place he had imagined himself. This wasn't a vacation or an adventure. This was real life, and it was much harder than he had ever expected. Jake was taken to his cell, a small room with just a bed, a metal toilet, and a small window that let in only a sliver of light. The door clanged shut behind him, and the reality of his situation hit him harder than ever. He was alone. He had no one to talk to, no way to escape his thoughts. He could only sit there and think about how he had ended up here. He thought about the Royal Guard, the seriousness of his role, and how he had so easily disrespected everything that guards stood for. Jake couldn't change what he had done, but now, in the silence of the prison cell, he realized something. He had made a mistake, a big one, but he could learn from it. He could spend this year reflecting on his actions, on the consequences of his choices, and maybe, just maybe, he could come out of this a better person. A year was a long time, but it was also a chance for Jake to think, to grow, and to make amends in ways he hadn't thought of before. The silence in his cell was deafening, but it was also the start of a new chapter in his life. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. The days in the prison passed slowly. At first, Jake couldn't adjust to the harsh routine. The clang of the gates, the cold walls, and the sound of footsteps in the hallways all became a part of his new reality. He missed the outside world, his family, his friends, and the freedom to go where he pleased. It felt like the world had moved on without him, and he was left behind to face the consequences of his mistake. Jake spent most of his time in his cell, thinking. It wasn't the time he had expected to have. At first, his mind was full of regret. He thought about what he could have done differently, how he could have avoided the whole situation. He thought about the Royal Guard, the tradition he had disrespected, and how his one reckless act had led to everything falling apart. Every time he closed his eyes, the scene replayed in his mind. But as the days went by, something began to change. Jake started to see things in a different light. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could learn from it. He had a whole year to think, and slowly he began to realize that this was an opportunity for growth. He started reading books, thinking about the choices he made in life, and the values he had once taken for granted. One afternoon, while sitting on his bed, Jake started writing. It wasn't a letter to anyone or a way to complain about his situation. It was simply a way for him to put his thoughts on paper. He wrote about the day he threw the beer, about how he had acted without thinking, and how he wished he could go back and make a better choice. He wrote about the consequences of that single moment, not just for him, but for others too. Writing helped Jake process his feelings. It helped him make sense of the chaos in his mind. Slowly, The bitterness and regret began to fade, replaced by something else: acceptance. He had made a mistake, but he was taking responsibility for it. That was the first step. And with each day, Jake felt like he was moving closer to understanding the kind of person he wanted to be when he left the prison. One day, as Jake was working in the prison yard, a guard stopped by. The man looked at Jake and said, "You've been keeping to yourself, huh?" Jake nodded. "It's the right thing to do," he replied, surprising himself with his answer. He wasn't trying to avoid anyone. He was just focused on reflecting and learning. The guard smiled faintly and said, "That's good. A lot of people don't learn. They just sit and complain." Those words stuck with Jake. He realized the importance of not just accepting responsibility, but also growing from the experience. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he approached the future. This year in prison was his chance to rebuild himself, to come out stronger, wiser, and ready to face the world again. By the time Jake's year was almost up, he wasn't the same person who had walked into the prison. He had changed. He had learned from his mistake, and while he still had regrets, he understood that they didn't define him. It was his actions moving forward that mattered now. As the day of his release came closer, Jake felt a mix of emotions: relief, hope, and a sense of responsibility. He had faced the consequences, and now he was ready to return to the world outside. He knew that life would not be easy, but he was prepared to face it with a new perspective. The year had been long, but it had been worth it. It had taught him the most important lesson of all: that growth comes from facing our mistakes, not running from them. Jake stepped out of the prison gates, taking a deep breath. He was ready to start over, with a new understanding of respect, responsibility, and the power of second chances.